Detective Ray Harlan leaned back in his chair, studying the aging case file in front of him. It was one of the oldest, dustiest in the cold case room, and yet it still gnawed at him. 15 years ago, a young woman named Emily Driscoll had been murdered in her apartment, and no one had ever been charged with the crime. He had been a rookie detective at the time, barely involved with the case, but now, years later, it was back on his desk. The details of the case were hauntingly ordinary yet chilling. Emily had been found in her small apartment, slumped on the living room floor, with a single stab wound to the chest. The scene was shockingly clean. No blood trail, no defensive wounds, and no sign of a struggle. It was as if the killer had simply walked in, done the deed, and walked out. There was nothing missing, no sign of forced entry. Her fiancé Daniel had been the initial suspect, given they'd had a rocky relationship and that he was known to have visited her that night. But his alibi had checked out, and in time the case had gone cold. Ray was now a seasoned detective with a reputation for solving even the most tangled cases, yet this one stumped him. There was no murder weapon, no fingerprints, and no leads. Emily's friends had described her as cheerful and upbeat, with no known enemies. Ray sighed, flipping through the interview transcripts for the 100th time. He finally came across the statement from the neighbor who had called the police, an older woman named Mrs. Cartwright. She'd heard a scream around midnight, a single high-pitched wail that shattered the quiet of the apartment complex. "Maybe it's time to talk to her again," Ray muttered. He was grasping at straws, he knew, but it was better than sitting in his office, staring at the walls. He arrived at Mrs. Cartwright's apartment later that afternoon. She greeted him with a warm smile, her blue eyes sharp even at 80. "Detective Harlan," she said, ushering him in, "I was wondering if anyone would ever come back to look into that poor girl's case." "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Mrs. Cartwright," he said. "I just have a few questions, things that may not have seemed important back then, but might help us now." "Of course," she said, settling into an armchair. He began with basic questions about what she had seen or heard the night of Emily's murder. She recounted everything exactly as she had in the transcript: the scream, the silence that followed, the police arriving. But something in her tone changed when he asked about Emily's relationships. "She had a bit of a troubled relationship with her fiancé, didn't she?" he asked. Mrs. Cartwright's eyes flickered and she pursed her lips. "They did argue often. I'd hear them shouting through the walls now and then. It was nothing out of the ordinary, though." He noted her hesitation. "Do you think he could have harmed her?" "Oh no," she said, waving her hand. "He was hot-headed but harmless. No, it was someone else, I'm sure of it." Ray leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Someone else? Did you see anyone that night?" She shook her head slowly. "I never saw anyone come or go that night, no. But—" her voice softened, as if afraid to speak the words aloud. It was almost like she knew it was coming. Ray's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "Emily was a sweet girl, but I'd see her sitting alone sometimes, staring out the window, almost expectant. She'd sometimes say strange things. She told me once that she felt like someone was watching her, waiting. I thought it was just paranoia." Ray felt a cold tingle run down his spine. Could Emily have known her killer? "Mrs. Cartwright," he asked slowly, "do you think whoever did this was close to her?" The old woman looked away, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Closer than she would have wanted, I suppose." The comment gnawed at him as he drove back to the station. There was something in Mrs. Cartwright's voice that he couldn't shake, a hint of guilt, almost like she was hiding something. He pulled Emily's file back out, scanning through her list of contacts and relationships. Mrs. Cartwright wasn't mentioned anywhere, but he knew she had been friendly with Emily. It wouldn't hurt to check her background. After hours of digging through records, he finally stumbled upon a detail that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Cartwright wasn't her real name. She'd changed it 15 years ago, shortly after Emily's death, and before that, her name was Elaine Driscoll. Ray's mind raced. Mrs. Cartwright was Emily's estranged mother. The pieces snapped together. Emily had been a foster child, bounced around in the system, and her biological mother had tried to find her later in life. According to the file, Emily had been reluctant to reconnect, harboring painful memories from her early years. Mrs. Cartwright, Elaine, must have come back into her life desperate to reconcile. But maybe the conversation had gone sour, maybe an argument had erupted, and in a moment of anger. Ray could almost see it. The mother, frantic and full of regret, thrusting a knife into her daughter's chest in a fit of rage, perhaps even by accident. He closed the file slowly, realizing with chilling certainty why the case had gone unsolved for so long. The one person who had called in the murder, the one person who had heard the scream, was the killer herself. As Ray sat back, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in her apartment, Mrs. Cartwright still kept the knife, the last piece of the puzzle, hidden away, forever tying her to the daughter she'd never truly let go. Sirs, I'm here because there's something I need to see, he continued, stepping into her parlor. As she watched him, he moved toward a shelf filled with antiques, her eyes following his every move. Among them was an ornate box, a family heirloom she had always kept close. When Ray carefully opened it, his eyes fell upon a sleek, an old knife nestled within a velvet box lining. It looked pristine, almost new. Mrs. Cartwright's breathing quickened. That knife was my father's, she said, her voice breaking. It's not what you think. Ray nodded, but he could see through her denial. The forensic team would confirm what he already knew. This knife was the missing piece, the silent witness to Emily's last moments. With quiet resolve, he turned to Mrs. Cartwright. Elaine Driscoll, you're under arrest for the murder of Emily Driscoll. Her hands shook as the reality of her secret, hidden for so many years, finally unraveled. I only wanted her to listen, she whispered as the cuffs clicked into place. But she hated me. It just happened. Ray said nothing more as he led her out, feeling the weight of justice settling at last. The case that had haunted him for 15 years was finally over, its last echoes now resting in silence.